Hey everyone, welcome to the webinar and thank you for joining us today. I'm Dana Baranowski, the marketing manager here at Elevated Signals, and I'll be your moderator today. We've got an awesome session lined up today. We've got our friend Michael Chin on the line here, who is the former chief of farm operations at Vertical Harvest, and we've got Hardeep Shoker, who's the chief operating officer here at Elevated Signals. Today, we're going to be chatting about becoming a data-driven business. First, we'll talk about what that really means and how you can use operations data to make better decisions for your business. So we're grateful to have Michael Chen here. He helped Vertical Harvest digitize their operation. So he'll be talking about how to go from kind of a very manual process to implementing a digital solution. And of course, Hardeep has helped many companies digitize over the years, so he'll have lots of great insights there. My job here today is to be the moderator, so I'm just keeping everyone on track to make sure we cover all the topics. Realistically, this could be an entire day workshop, but we only have an hour. So I'll make sure that we have enough time to cover everything and have questions at the end. If anyone has questions, you can enter them in through the Q&A function at the bottom panel of Zoom, and we'll have time to answer them at the end. So without further ado, let's jump into this. Michael, pass it off to you to kick us off with some introductions and just a little bit about yourself, as well as the work that you've done at Vertical Harvest and beyond.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Dana and Hardeep, for having me today. Really looking forward to this conversation. As Dana mentioned, I came to know of Elevated Signals. My last role as Chief of Farm Operations at Vertical Harvest, which is an indoor farming company that uses technology to grow plants indoors, whether that's controlling the climate, artificial light, etc., and to grow it in layers, as the name suggests. Prior to that, I've actually been in the indoor farming sector for a few years. I was at another company that was based out of New York City prior to that, and had been looking at the sector for a little while. My background is about 25 years in, broadly speaking, the tech sector. I happened to start my career in the late 90s in Silicon Valley. So there were a few options for career direction, but I picked the one that was most exciting, working in tech startup land, and have sort of ridden the waves of new technology over time, particularly working sort of in the startup phase. So a lot of that frames the way that I think about data. A lot of it obviously frames the way I think about software and the application of that in business.
Awesome. Thanks, Michael. Pass it off to you, Hardeep, for a quick intro.
Sounds good. Yeah, so I'm Hardeep, COO of Elevated Signals. My background is mostly in software development, so about 17 years of professional development. I think one of the things that happened along the way when we were developing Elevated Signals is that the way I think, because of my training in software development, is very systems oriented. And so when it comes to Elevated Signals and the work that we do, a lot of it is trying to help organizations set up systems so that they can kind of answer the questions that they're trying to solve for maybe the stage of the business that they're in, or their ambitions for the year or the next 5 years. It's really thinking about how do we help support organizations through that. So my role is to really support in that function for Elevated Signals, and it's been really great working with Michael, and I think we're going to have a really awesome chat.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so I wanted to jump in. I think where it makes sense to start this conversation is around the problem that Michael was facing with Vertical Harvest, for example. So Michael, can you walk us through kind of like what the challenges that you were facing that drove you to even consider data digitization? And also, like, can you explain what data digitization means to you?
Yeah, that second question is probably a pretty big one, pretty broad one. That probably a number of different interpretations of that, depending on who you speak to. And Hardeep, at any time, please jump in. I'm very curious to get your take on it, given what you see in the industry and your experience. Um, it's really a means to an end, is the way that I thought about it. And as Hardeep said, it's really about answering certain questions in a business. So whether it was my last company or others before, at any given point in time, you're making a decision to do one thing or the other, right? I mean, stating the obvious, but I try to keep things as simple as possible. And so, especially whether you're an early stage company or a scaling or scale up type of company or a mature business, what I found is that you're trying to make those decisions based on something. Early stage companies, you don't have that much data to work with, so it's a little bit more difficult. But as you grow and mature, and as you age along as a business and move through the various stages, trying to collect as much of that and organize it in the way that makes sense, so that you can use it to help you make those decisions, makes all the difference in the world, from my point of view. Now, digitizing it in the context of let's call it manufacturing, which was what vertical harvest and indoor farming is really about. Man, okay, how do you get the data in one place, organize it efficiently so that you can use it in some way or the other? And I think those of us on the operations side and production and manufacturing sometimes have, obviously, given what we do for a living, somewhat of a narrow view on that. But the way that I thought about it was, well, that information needs to be useful to other parts of the organization, whether that's sales, finance, etc. So to me, it really became about, well, how do you collect that data in a single place, make it really efficient and easy to collect all of that data, organize it in a way that made sense based on whatever your business model is, and then make it really available to everybody. I can't think of any other way than using all of the digital tools that we have today. Certainly pen and paper ain't going to work. And you see very quickly the limits of what you can do with spreadsheets and things like that. So for me, it was very much about how do I collect it in one place, one central source of truth, as I'm sure you've heard a lot about. So everything that trickles down from there is about how do you get that into a place structured well and make it usable. Hardeep, what have you seen?
I mean, I think, yeah, you're 100% right. And like, I think even thinking beyond just, like the areas of work that we participate in, like even within our own business, we're constantly hungry for data and for information, because like today's markets are so hyper competitive and aggressive, and you really need to kind of understand your business inside and out to really be effective in the market. And I feel like it's one of those things that just is really, you know, there's no barriers in terms of like, oh, this is only for really operational, minded organizations. It's just a way of operating within today's economy. And actually, there was a really interesting case study to read, which is totally not related to our industry, but 7-Eleven, 7-Eleven Japan and 7-Eleven in the US. Um, there's a really phenomenal story there about how 7-Eleven was a really data-driven organization and ended up buying 7-Eleven of America and running it, and how those two entities run so differently, and how the American 7-Eleven is now trying to replicate the data-driven approaches of the Japanese 7-Eleven, right? So I think everything that you're saying makes total sense. And it, just going back to kind of like that systems thinking, it really is like, well, why are we doing this thing? Like if we want to improve this aspect of our business, let's say like if you're in a CPG or something like that, you want to increase yield, you want to cut down costs or anything like that, you really need to understand where you're going to make those adjustments and then be able to measure the impacts to the outputs of the work that you're doing, right? And it only comes from really understanding the data. Like to what you said, Michael, it's having it in one place in those tools. So it becomes almost like a communication tool within the organization of your progress as well. Because if people don't have visibility into it, it becomes really hard to kind of rally an organization around a common goal, right? So, yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I was just gonna say, like, I'm kind of curious about your point of view around the timing of everything. Like, at what point is it that, traditional data management methods aren't working anymore? And how do you know that you've gotten to that point?
Yeah. Yeah, maybe Mike, I'll let you finish your thought. I think you're about to jump in, but it's really a question. Yeah.
Well, first of all, I just want to set aside you bringing up 7-Eleven Japan. I have a slight obsession with that entire operation. For those of you who have ever experienced a
Yeah, me.
7-Eleven in Japan, it
Yeah,
will absolutely blow your mind, especially
That'll be our
if,
next webinar.
yeah.
what an incredible operation, what an incredible logistical undertaking in a country. It's
Weather
phenomenal.
patterns, demographic information, distribution, logistics, all of this information coming together to provide a really good like customer experience that if you've ever been to one, people just rave about it, right? So
Oh, yeah, get yourself an egg salad sandwich, whether you
yeah.
like it or not. Get yourself one.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry about that. Well, I was just going to sort of answer the other part of Dana's question, which was what are the problems and what were the main challenges? I think this is probably pretty common, right? Especially in either early stage companies past a certain point to those that are trying to scale up. In my experience, often you're really struggling just to get a real picture of what's happening within the operation itself, whether that's the productivity question that you're trying to answer, what are we yielding? What is the yield that we're getting within the facility costing us? All of these really basic and fundamental questions from a business point of view in terms of production, and that how much are we wasting and what's happening with that waste? Simple questions like that. How much money are we making? But sometimes even more importantly, how much could we be making?
Yeah.
And without that information, or without the information being easily available and accessible to the right people within the organization, there you get so much inertia, especially once the machine is running. It's really hard to throw resources that you can't really throw at it. And I'm sure for those of you in production or in operations, you're just trying to get through the day most of the time, right? You've got people coming in for a shift. So and so didn't show up. How do I troubleshoot this? There's a shipment issue. How do I troubleshoot that? And so you're constantly having to juggle that. And at some point, if you fall too far behind on the data piece of it, it's almost impossible or very, very difficult to catch up. So those were the types of things that I've seen in my career. And I'm sure you've heard the quote. I don't know who said this. If you can't measure it, you can't improve it. Maybe we can attribute it to Bruce Lee because he gets all the attributions in every quote. But it's obviously true. It resonates, I think, in so many situations. And I certainly have found that throughout my career, and There are points in time where you do have to take a step back, take a little bit of a productivity hit. And we can talk a little bit about how I've experienced that in my career, maybe a little bit further down in the discussion.
Yeah, I think that's a great jumping off point. So just kind of to summarize like your thoughts, it's the bigger picture is that you wanted to make improvements in the business, but you didn't really have the visibility on what exactly is going on in the facility. So you didn't have a jumping off point to how do I improve this part of operations? How do I cut costs? How do I find new business opportunities? And so that led you to explore solutions to really centralize all of that data in a single spot. So I guess the next step is the actual, getting off of Excel sheets and paper and digitizing your systems. I'd say this is probably like the biggest hurdle in this entire process is really, making that transition. So can you explain what that process was like for you, and how you were able to do that?
Yeah. There are a few tricky parts that I've seen happen over and over again. I think, look, first of all, your spreadsheets and multiple iterations of that over time that can develop. I'm sure many people have seen that and experienced it as well. It's sort of, in the early stages of your operation, sort of make a lot of sense, right? It's very easy to do. There's not a lot of friction. And if your production and processes, your production recipes, and your materials and that are pretty straightforward, it's quite easy to track, and very easy to get up and running. What I found is over time, inevitably, as you iterate through the processes, as you iterate through your manufacturing and even your products, and you head into product development, that's where you sort of run into, oh no, why am I on version 7 of something that I've tried? Whereas that piece of data that I'm recording off of this one bit of process is version 6A. And then it gets really super complex. So, in my experience, and granted, I've stepped into facilities that have been in operation for a number of years. I realized right away that, oh, wow, I might have a vision of what I need to get done here. Like we talked about, how do I centralize all of that data so that inputs come in structured in the right way and easily output to other parts of the organization? How do I do that in an operating facility where I've got to be mindful of things like lessening the burden and disruption on the team, where maybe there's some skill sets and gaps in the skill sets that I've got to deal with there. How do I think about that? And how do I even begin to understand what's happening based on the data that you might have? And how do I think about, okay, when is there a natural break in the operations so that we can begin to implement some new things? So it really sort of took a lot of taking a step back to see what was happening to try to understand that. And I guess you could go about it where you just flip the switch and go for it. In my experience, that was more challenging than not. So it really became about how do you transition and transition that work in as least disruptive a way as possible, but capture as much of that as quickly as possible and have the team learn and change the culture slightly as much as possible as well. Hardeep, what's been your experience with that with
Yeah,
your
I mean,
clients?
this is this is really interesting one for me because I think just coming from the software world, like there's two concepts that I think are very valuable. And they do come into like lean operations if you follow like any of the Toyota methodologies or anything like that. But it's really two concepts. One is MVP, right? Minimum viable product. And you can apply that to basically anything. I'll explain that. And then the other one is like the concept of agile. And I'll explain that one as well. So spreadsheets are absolutely phenomenal for rapid prototyping. So when you don't know exactly the process, and you just want, and they're really great when like the number of people involved in the spreadsheet is one, right? And so you're trying to basically understand how to establish a process, and what you don't have a really good mental model of is like, what is the information that I should be collecting, right? Um, I have a processing line that's running, and there's some sort of improvement that I'm trying to look to make, right? So maybe it comes down to like there's too many rejects as a part of my automated process, and I need to figure out how to resolve this issue. Well, there's a certain set of data points that I probably need to consider, right? Like, so, what are the parameters on the machine? Like what like is where does that process essentially break down? Is it feeding material into the machine? Is it the actual machine that runs, and it's the variables that you've assigned in terms of like the feed rate of material is too fast or too slow? There's all these like little parameters that you kind of want to think about. Um, it's very overwhelming to try to institutionalize that, because you're going to have to make many iterations to your point, Michael, of having like lots of different spreadsheets over time. And so there's this rapid prototyping, which is like you are creating a minimal viable product of a report that is going to help you understand how to get the desired output of having less rejected product. And then there's agile, which is you are working in an agile fashion where you are iteratively improving the understanding of the process, which is, data is kind of like a loaded buzzword sometimes, but really it's just like, oh, hey, here's something that I didn't know. Well, I should capture this information so that the next time I can kind of like look back at it and see, did this improve or did it not improve, right? So having this MVP concept and having this agile kind of methodology in working is where a spreadsheet is really great. Where I've seen it really break down for a lot of organizations, and where organizations come and try to seek help from us, is when there's just too many spreadsheets at that point. Every department has a different set of spreadsheets. They're all tracking overlapping information, right? They're all tracking sometimes like inventory counts. They're tracking labor information. They're tracking actual like KPIs within the processes themselves. And usually, like, in order for any department to function, they need information from other departments as well. And so that's where we see a lot of challenges for businesses, is that they have these multitude of places where they're putting all this information, and sometimes it's on whiteboards, and sometimes it's on papers, and sometimes it's on Excel, and sometimes it's within this software or this software. When we go in, what we're trying to understand is like, well, what is that information that the organization needs as a whole? And we start usually there, right? So going back to MVP, like we're trying to start with the least amount of information that needs to be tracked, where it doesn't create a huge burden on the team to be able to use this system and incorporate it into their day-to-day processes. Like that is ultimately kind of the goal. But we do see like like most of our um, we actually call it a competitive replacement. So as a software company, one of our main sources of competitive replacements is spreadsheets and paper and whiteboards. Like that's a system that we're often replacing.
So it sounds like we're talking about like an incremental implementation, right? Like an MVP. What is like the most critical information that the company needs right now? Once that's done, everyone's comfortable with it, you can kind of implement the next stage.
It's like layering on.
Yeah. Yeah, so Michael, I'm curious to hear like what was it like working with the ES team, and like was the process that you took to actually get everyone from paper to spread or paper and spreadsheets to elevated signals?
Yeah. This was a really interesting journey for me. When I joined Vertical Harvest, I sort of went through that process of, I was responsible for all of the farm operations, which basically meant the entire facility and everything that went into it, happened in it, and came out of it. So again, I took a little bit of a step back and said, okay, what's happening here? I need to understand this, but also keeping in mind that I was trying to scale the operations for multiple facilities that were in the pipeline to be built. So it was really interesting actually because very early on, I think it might have been the first week I was on the job. I happened to be at a conference in New York and met Hardeep uh, for the first time, and I had this idea, this notion of okay, I need to have this centralized in one place or the other, and I'm sure many of you have been through this process of looking at ERPs, different systems, etc. And very quickly, I understood what elevated signals could do, and it was exactly what I needed to have built out. So when we started to kick that off, initially I was like, I come from the software sector. I'd spent the previous 10 years in kind of big data world, and so it was kind of second nature to me. But very quickly I realized, oh wow, this is a very different environment. This is a very different set of skills and expertise and experiences. And the road was much choppier than I thought it would be. The things that I had taken for granted because of my own experiences weren't the case. And I also realized, okay, I don't have that many resources available to me. And so that was where the elevated signals team really stepped in. Look, I'm going to be talking you guys up for a moment here, but it made all the difference in the world. And what I realized is, look, there's a stage that you're an early stage or early stages of trying to scale up, where you might not know what resources you need, let alone having a full-time data analyst on board to be able to do that type of work. And that was a situation that I found myself in. So we had a couple of team members, Corey and Alex from Elevated Signals, spend some time in the facility. First thing they did was do a process map of the entire thing. So they spent the week with the team on the floor of the facility and learned as quickly as possible. They did a phenomenal job and mapped out that entire process and where the critical data points were that needed to be collected. We didn't care at that point about fixing anything. It was really about how do you get clean data in so that we could even understand what was happening. And again, it was a monumental resource lift from where I was sitting at the time. And then from there, it really became about, okay, how do I then adapt the processes, particularly around people and training them because they were stuck on their workflow and no fault of anyone's other than that's the way it was and that's the way it can be. And so it was very much about, okay, how do we train people? And maybe we can have a bit of a conversation about that in a bit around the change management part of it. That was probably the heaviest lift and took months to get the team thinking a certain way, get the team understanding what they could get out of the data and out of all of this work. But once they got that, things started falling into place.
Yeah, I guess touching on that change management piece, it's like now that you've kind of identified this as a solution for your organization and you can kind of articulate it, how do you get the rest of the team on board, not only just the people in the facility who are going to be the users of the software, but also like the greater team? What was your
Yeah,
experience there?
Yeah. I mean, look, people generally, when they're trying to get through the day in a production facility,
Yeah, putting out
it's
fires.
yeah, you're just putting out fires all day long, and that type of thing. I'm sure that's a very familiar sort of experience and feeling of a lot of people that are on this call or would use elevated signals. So, um, once you're stuck on that workflow, it's pretty difficult to switch off, right? And you're coming in, you're doing your job, you're recording what you have to, and all of that. Um, so it look, at the end of the day, it's not anything that's magic or anything like that. People have to understand why you're asking them to do the things that they're doing, why you're asking them to put an investment of their time when they're trying to get their job done and do whatever it is that they need to through the day, to either slow things down, take a step back, or make a pretty significant change. It's a fairly significant change to grab a pen and write something down on a piece of paper, oh, I have to learn how to use this software, which is very different to me, completely new. At times, maybe a little bit more complex because writing something down on a piece of paper is so simple. Why can't I just keep doing that? Where's the value in it for me? And where's the value in it for what I need to do on a day-to-day basis? So there was a lot of um, trying to build a foundational understanding of the why, and trying to build a foundational understanding, but also reinforce that as quickly as possible in the results that they were seeing. So there was a big breakthrough in it where it was pushing it uphill, that type of thing, getting the managers on board and understanding it and having them trickle that down to the rest of the staff. But it became very clear that we had to show the team the results of that
Yeah.
very quickly.
Mhm.
And we were able to do that. And once that happened, to then take that next step to say, okay, now we're seeing good data, accurate data, good or bad, regardless of what that is. Here's how we're going to use it, and here's what that means. And then to reinforce that as quickly as possible. So showing those hops, and keeping the pressure on that, um, I think makes a big deal of difference.
Yeah. I think you highlighted something that's like really important, which is the why. Why am I doing this thing? Um, I think that sometimes a lot of teams really struggle with change management and like having successful change management of a process because like you said, if I'm just trying to, I've got like a set quota that we're going to try to produce for the day, I just want to try to produce that thing. I want to kind of go home, enjoy my life, like that sort of thought process, right? So it really is like, well, what is the greater benefit to us changing this, right? Like it's going to be a couple weeks of, you know, like things are going to fail, things are going to break. We, it's okay, if we're trying to like fumble and learn over the next 2 weeks, like creating that space for experimentation is very easy. Understanding and recognizing that through the change management process, there is going to be like a loss of productivity in some way. These are things that if you can create that sort of environment for the team, it kind of takes the edge off a little bit in terms of you trying to achieve your objective, which is to improve, the business. So, but like really fundamentally, that why are we doing this, right? Like, how does what they're doing impact, the business overall, and then how does that impact them as an individual? Like, do they now all of a sudden have to do this one mundane task less, right? Like, do they get to do something a little bit more interesting? We see that like that's something that we try to communicate often when we're going into an organization and trying to help them with a process. It's like, well, you guys are doing that in this way. If you just change it up a little bit, like now you can actually work on this other problem that's probably far more interesting and far more impactful to your business, right? It's you don't need to do the the paperwork for this because there's machines that can calculate all this stuff out for you. They're really really good at it.
Yeah, for sure. It's the two elements, like this, I think the stakeholders like the CEO and CFO could definitely understand the value of like pulling data information related to decision making, but ultimately it's the people who are on the ground that are going to be using it. And if you don't have proper adoption there, then back to Michael's points, like is the data in here accurate? Is it up to date?
Fun phrase, garbage in, garbage out.
Yeah, garbage in, garbage out. Yeah, exactly. But I agree, like the thing that I've seen, for example, within the cannabis industry specifically, it's like even just the people who are like doing the day-to-day inventory management or doing the CTS reports, right? They're spending so much time gathering all that information and reconciling it. It's just like a frustrating thing for them day to day. If you're able to provide them with tools to help make that easier for them, then it's something that shows like an improvement in quality of life in their day to day. You know, so we've got a doorbell ringing here. I'll throw it over to maybe like Hardeep, if you could talk about like if you could give like three pieces of advice for adoption and internal buy-in, like what would they look like based on like because you've done so many implementations, like
Yeah.
what are kind of the things that stand out to you?
Sorry, in terms of
Like internal buy-in and product adoption, change management.
yeah, okay. So this is I think one of the things that we really try to focus on, and I actually learned this from Slack. So Slack, uh, and it's more how they got their product into market than it is like necessarily how they ran their business. So Slack, when they got their product into market, it was a really big push to change an entire organization's communication strategy, like going from email to a chat app. If you're a large organization, it's a ton of change management, right? Um, there's so much buy-in that you have to get across the organization. And so one of the things that they did, and I'll explain how this kind of ties back into to us here, but one of the things that they did for their product was they tried to get their product used by a very small group within the organization, show some success of that adoption, and then scale the adoption team to team overall, right? That works for certain processes. It doesn't work for all processes, but that fundamental principle is really a mindset that we have leveraged to great success. Like, we've helped over 100 manufacturing firms at this point get off of like paper pen type systems. Sometimes they had other software. And that's always the mentality that we brought into it. It's kind of like this staged approach where we try to understand, like what is the business objective? And then how are we basically going to break down this problem, right? Like, and try to get it implemented within the organization. So if it was like lessons learned, kind of like key takeaways, really try to distill the problem down into one focus area. Like, so for example, one that we do all the time is having a good understanding of inventory, right? We don't try to, well, actually, even within that, we usually scope it down to a area of inventory that is a problem. So for certain organizations, it could be packaging material. For certain types of organizations, it could be raw materials, right? It could be things that you procured, things that you're selling. So we try to understand, even within inventory, is there a small enough chunk that we can kind of take on that allows us to get a quick win for the organization, so that then we can take kind of the next leap. And it's like, okay, we've demonstrated success here. Now there's this other department that's also having some challenges. We've created some trust with the organization that we can go ahead and get something successfully deployed. A lot of organizations have failure in change management. um, so I think it's like you gotta really find a small sliver within the organization that you're going to impact. You want to work with that team very intimately, get that problem addressed and solved, and then what you want to try to figure out is, how do you demonstrate the success? Because ultimately, if you have success in that one area, there's a downstream or upstream effect on another team or department, where all of a sudden they're getting access to this information in a much more streamlined way that they've never had access to. They have to ask less questions. There's less, you know, the game, the telephone game, where it's like, yes, it's like the information changes like hour to hour, whatever it is, day to day. It's like you really want to, yeah, just get a small amount of success and be able to demonstrate that to another department, so that then they get curious and they want to also see some of these benefits for areas of challenges that they're having.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Again, like tying in this like incremental, but you can do it in kind of different
In
ways.
different ways, yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. Okay, one thing that I really want to touch on that we didn't really get to discuss is the analyzing the data part and actually making decisions using that data. I think the first step is just, transitioning from paper spreadsheets to a digital system. So now you can see what's going on in the facility. You have visibility. It solves like certain problems for you, right? Like for example, like how much inventory you have. You can prevent stockouts, things like that. But I think we can get even more granular there. Michael, you have a lot of experience with this part of it. It's especially like you mentioned, you were able to improve yield for vertical harvest. So, what does it look like to actually be able to take that data and make it usable, to be able to access it quickly to make a decision for the business?
Yeah, yeah. So if you strip it to the fundamentals, as Hardeep said right on the onset, what is the question you're trying to answer? And for the indoor farming sector, when you think about yield, it's really a real estate issue. The sort of atomic unit is, I have a given area of space. How much value can I get out of that as quickly as possible? So if you think about it that way, the sort of fundamental sort of data point, which said whether or not you're going to be potentially successful with an operation, was yield per square foot per given period of time, a year, right? So how many pounds are you able to produce for every square foot of growing space or production space that you have in a given period of time? So for me, everything started and stopped there, because once I understood that, and once everybody internalized that is the most important metric in that business, which then indicates what your upper bounds could be for the business and the total productivity of a given facility, you can work your way backwards off of that. So trying to understand that and come up with a way to view that within the operation unlocked everything else. Now, there's a lot of complexity in it, and there's a lot of different ways you can think about it depending on what you're manufacturing. But in the case of an indoor farm that produces leafy greens that is a blended product that goes into different SKUs, think of it as a salad mix. That can be a little bit complex when you're dealing with 15, 16 different crops that are packaged into a given SKU in different percentages, a period of time, all of that. So there's a little bit of math that goes into it. But once you get to that point, and whatever that highest order data point is, then you can begin to work down from that. So we really focused on that. And the one thing I would add in terms of internal buy-in and all of that, especially in the initial phases, to try to understand this and to try to build an efficient operation around it. Obviously, the finance team is a really important partner to everything. And I happened to have a really great partner at Vertical Harvest in the CFO who understood the fundamentals of the business. Now, he and I argued about whether we should go with the manufacturing module that he was already using in the accounting software because it's easy, it's blah, blah, blah. Whereas I was looking at it from an operational point of view. And we can talk a little bit about getting buy-in there. But once we aligned on that, and then the conversation became very simple. It became, what information do you need from operations for you to make decisions in finance? And then you can have that conversation quite easily.
Yeah. Maybe just to kind of bounce off of that a little bit, because I think sometimes, even understanding what questions you should be asking is like, if you sit down and you think about that, like takes quite a bit of time to really sift through that. But I think you just highlighted it, where it's like you have interactions within your organization where people are kind of requesting things, right? They're asking you questions, and that is an opportunity to ask another question, which is, could I have basically not had this conversation? Could I have just put this information in front of them, and then I didn't need to be asked for this? They could have found this information for themselves. And if they can find it for themselves, I'm sure there's actually a few more people that can get value from this information as well. Because if I talk to that person and I answer their question for them, like they're actually getting a question from somebody else, and then there's a question from somebody else, right? So it's like this chain of questions that everybody's trying to kind of like, everybody's asking a very similar question, and so it's just like you just gotta kind of identify those things, right? Like you could even have like a little journal, which is like, what did people ask me today? And then like, why did they ask me this? I think that is something that I often do quite a bit, just mentally, not actually writing it down, but it's like, well, who asked me for this? Why did they ask me for it? And then that kind of helps me start building a bit of a mental model in terms of like, well, what is the information that we should actually be thinking about and tracking for the department, which also leads to your other point. It's like, you guys had a meeting where this information was like front and center, right? Like that's another point of like there's questions that are being asked, right? Like what is our productivity over the quarter, right? Like what were our sales? What was the sales this quarter versus last quarter, right? Did we improve? Like those kind of higher level business questions, like that, like to answer any one of those, you have to go down so many departments or so many people to kind of just like source like the numbers back up. Right? So that's another way I thought might be interesting to think about it. Yeah.
That's a really good point. I'm doing a time check. We've got 10 minutes left. So I'm going to open it up for Q&A. I don't see any in the chat right now, but I did get a couple before the webinar, which we can ask. So wondering how you'd measure ROI on digitizing operations and what kind of time frame would you actually see results? I think, yeah, this is a really good question, especially like what I've heard in the past from our previous clients is a lot of like really long implementations and lots of incomplete implementations. So it'd be great to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, Michael, I don't know if you want to answer it first. I can also share some thoughts.
Yeah. I mean, there's obviously the somewhat straightforward, do the math, kind of how quickly can you get the team on board, and how quickly can you uh, uh, get the operation, into a system, and are they working? Are they doing what they need to, and all of that? Um, there were probably most two of the strongest signals that I've seen. One is, um, how quickly can you answer the questions, those fundamental questions, right? How quickly can you get to that point? And what is the impact to the business of doing that? Now, it's very difficult to measure that or compare it against an unknown. And what I mean by that is, well, I don't know, how quickly I would have gotten to this answer otherwise. And I suppose you could do a bit of math and look backwards and that type of thing to see sort of what you've done in the past. So that's the one way. But the other way is, I guess, a little bit more of the sense of culture, right? And how quickly can you get the team thinking a certain way? How quickly can you get them to begin to even implement concepts like Kaizen to try to improve a given process and that type of thing? So for me, it was very much about, okay, once you have everything in place as quickly as possible, how quickly can you move, and how quickly can you push a given agenda of improvement, let's call it that, and try to measure that against, whether it's your overall business objectives. Are you, it's very simple. Are you making more money? Are you losing less money in the operation? Are you becoming more efficient? And it's, I think, really important to click into those types of KPIs and metrics as quickly as possible, so that you can see those tangible results.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's like no hidden secret that every business needs to make money, right? So it's like it I think your earlier point of um, finance, getting finance involved, like they can really help sometimes quantify this. Like I guess like there's I don't think this is controversial, but like I think there's it really depends on what stage of organization you're in, and like the where you are at in terms of like how many years you've been in business, and like what your objectives are, and things like that. Like I do think that fundamentally, um, like to me personally, it's absolutely wild that organizations will use pen and paper. Like and the reason for this is like businesses have invested millions of dollars in terms of structure, paying salaries. Like it's a very expensive operation, right? And so if you think about like lasting and surviving and thriving in a market, like it, I think the reality of today's world is that like if you look at like macroeconomics, right, capital access to capital is like very difficult. And so what pressure does that create on organizations? It's like they have to become really efficient in terms of like the cash that they have from an operating perspective. And so if you're in that position, then what that means is that you have to really, really understand the business inside and out. And in order to understand the business inside and out, you need to be able to have, my earlier comment of like garbage in, garbage out, like you can't have the wrong data. Like you just simply can't have the wrong data. So for an organization, like I think like if I was to think about it from a very foundational perspective, you need to have good data tracking like systems and good hygiene of the information that you're relying on in order to understand like can I be profitable, right? Like, okay, if I am profitable, like where am I going to invest any of the excess capital that I have? Or if I'm not profitable, what decisions do I need to make, right? Like, there's so many decisions that come into understanding the market that you're playing in. Like what is like I did a skew analysis of a market one time, and I found that there was about 300 players in the market just selling one product, right? And the margins were so low. And then when I went and did an analysis of like, well, how many other products did they have? They sometimes didn't really have another product, and so it's like in terms of the percentiles of like the on the upper end versus the lower end, like a lot of them fell in the middle, and it was like, well, you're in like a really compressed market. There's not a lot of margin. And so this is like a very dangerous area to be in, right? And so like from that perspective, if you don't have the information, like there's a reason why most startups fail, right? And it really, really comes down to like how good you are at operating your business. Like if you just look at some of the most successful companies, like you mentioned 7-Eleven, Japan, Amazon, right? Like any of these larger giants that manage these very complex operations, like they understand every single data point within their organization. Somebody is looking at that number. There's a KPI attached to those data points because you just don't measure something for no reason, right? Like there's a KPI, and somebody is either trying to move that KPI up or down depending on what it is. And that is goes back to that cultural aspect that you're talking about.
Yeah, and there's maybe a way to also think about it where you can measure, you can split ROI into the tactical and the strategic, right? So the
Yes.
tactical is very straightforward. You plug it into the books, you see how much your cost of goods sold, how efficient's the labor, all of that sort of stuff. So that's a really simple way to look at it. I shouldn't say simple, but business fundamental.
Yes.
Where it's maybe a little bit more of a gray area is, to your point, what's the ROI on the decision making? How quickly can not just one department, but any department get to a decision, get to the information they need to be able to make a decision, and then you can measure the quality of that decision based on the outcome, right? So here's an example. I talked to a manufacturer a little while ago who was struggling with getting insight into their operation. And when I talked to the sales team, one of the things that came out was we don't have a picture of finished goods in real time. So they literally have to go down to the warehouse to see what was available before they could respond to a customer who wanted to place an order. So you can very clearly measure, I think, how many of those types of opportunities you're either losing or not being able to convert on quickly and against the level of effort it takes to get that piece of information to even go back to a customer and make a decision whether or not you're going to sell it to that person. So I think there's a little bit of that, and that speaks to, okay, the data living in silos is not very useful, and making that available across the organization, to Hardeep's point earlier, where the information's there. Like, I don't want sales to be breathing down my neck to give them some information or a data point. Like, just go look at it. It's there. And making that available in the way that they need to see it within a time frame that they need it, ideally in real time, I think is the ideal. And you can really sort of see, okay, how much effort do I need to put in to be able to get to that point to unlock whatever it is, new deals, profit, so on.
You just actually made me think about something. I find this a lot within kind of medium to larger scale businesses that have gone through like an ERP implementation. So how quickly can you kind of trying to look for the word, but it's like almost like start capturing that data point, right?
Mm.
So for example, I think it was like 3 or 4 conversations that I had like within this last year where it was like, well, in order to track this new piece of information in the ERP system, I actually have like a bit like a 2-week lead time where I need to talk to the IT people and they're gonna then go and configure the system, right? And it's like, well, in order to make any decision, in order to like capture the information, if I have like 2 weeks that I need to wait, well, what does that do? It forces me to now start tracking things on pen or spreadsheets. And now this information is disconnected from a system where everybody else relies on in order to like make any sort of decision. And so it's just like this like downward spiral of just, people having incomplete and information. And that all the root cause of that was that they weren't able to quickly and efficiently track that. One of the things that we did within our software platform, which I know you guys took advantage of as well, was that we had the custom data fields, which was like a drag and drop builder, so that you no longer had to rely on any like internal team members or any consultants to go and configure your software, and so that like teams could basically say, oh, I want to track this information and I want to track it on a work order, I want to track it on a batch record or a plant. Like they just drag, oh, I want to track a number or I want to track, some arbitrary text, sorry. And that basically made it so that we no longer had to be communicated with in order for them to basically add new features of information tracking to their own system. So that was actually something that was like really powerful for a lot of people, was just being able to do it themselves and do it within like 30 seconds, right? Like capture that information as soon as like they almost think about it, really. Yeah.
Awesome. So we're at time. So do you guys have any like last kind of remarks, anything that you felt like you didn't really get to touch on that you want to share?
I mean, I would say Michael is an absolute wizard when it comes to this stuff. So if you have any questions about operations, improving, and all that kind of stuff, yeah, like he's definitely your guy to talk to. So
Where can we reach you, Michael? How can people get in touch?
drop an email.
Yeah,
Yeah.
drop an email. So maybe we can, as follow up, if we can figure out how to get that out. That was very kind of you to say, Hardeep. I've learned an incredible amount working with elevated signals over the years. And if there's one advantage that I've had, it's simply been able to bridge two worlds. One of software and one of manufacturing, which interestingly enough seems to be a little bit of a gap in the sector. But no, if there's one thing I would leave people with is it can be a little bit of a steep hill to climb, at least in my experience. But taking those smaller bites that over time you can then take bigger bites out of it to eventually, enormous chunks. That really sort of helped. And of course, we all are under pressure to perform and get those results as quickly as possible. But in my experience, especially if you're in operations already, taking a little bit of a step back and a more incremental approach that's less burden on the team, keeps them on board and focused, and also less potentially disruptive, is a little bit of the penalty you have to take sometimes.
Awesome. Great
That's
takeaway.
great.
Yeah. Before we wrap up, I just want to share our newest offerings with Elevated Signals for anyone who's interested. Send a link here. You can learn more about them at www.elevatedsignals.com. But if you're at a stage where you're feeling like you need to get on like a digital platform to centralize inventory, say you're on paper and spreadsheets, we actually have a new offering called Elevated Signals 4, and you can actually get started on that for free. So again, you can check out our website to learn more about that. I know we have some customers in the audience as well. So if you're already using our platform and maybe you're looking to extract some more data from your operations to make faster and better decisions for your business, you can get in touch with us today as well. And we can get you set up on a call with our digital transformation team to make that happen. So again, you can find all that information on elevatedsignals.com. And I want to thank you guys, Hardeep and Michael, for our chat today. That was an awesome discussion. Definitely learned a lot. And thanks everyone in our audience who joined us today. We'll be sending you the recording as well as contact information for Michael and Hardeep in case you want to get in touch. We truly appreciate you guys for taking the time, and we hope you have a fantastic day. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.